So we're going to talk about classical conditioning today. We're going to talk about which classical conditioning actually relates to a lot of what we've actually been exposed to in education, because it represents the foundation of learning, and that's something we do in school every day. We learn. The founder of classical conditioning is a gentleman named Ivan Pavlov, and the irony of the situation is Ivan Pavlov really was not someone who had any respect for psychology, and he accidentally came across this theory while doing a scientific experiment about the stomach and the digestive system. We're going to talk about how he came up with this theory, how he broke it down, and then we're going to talk about the different ways, the methods that he talks about classically conditioning different animals and species with the unconditioned response, the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, and the conditioned stimulus. And then I'll open myself up for some questions. When I cover this, because usually over here, I don't cover this until second semester. I know a lot of your teachers already do, but it can be kind of confusing for my students, especially when we go into the UCR, the CS, the CR, the UCS. They're like, Ms. Valdez, what the heck are you talking about? And I'll try to make it as easy as possible for you. But please, if you have a question, ask it, because that's what I'm here for. Are we cool? All right, so let's go ahead and I'll give you some background information about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is actually related to the school of thought, which is one of the main perspectives of psychology, which is behaviorism. There would be no school of behaviorism if it was not for classical conditioning, because it's the basic foundation of how we learn and how us as a species and most species on this planet learn behaviors. Ivan Pavlov's experiment with a bell and a dog is when the concept of classical conditioning was born. And if you look over here at the little comic, and you see the dog and he's salivating, they're actually making in the Acme doorbell company next door out the window, and he's salivating. Most people don't get that until like the end of my lecture, but you'll understand when I talk about it later. But like as I said before, he's going to lay the foundation for John B. Watson, who is considered the father of behaviorism. And behaviorism is a school of thought that, as I tell my students, we are what we learn. Everything that makes us who we are, our actions, are things that we've learned as we've grown older. And they're things, and we learn through all sorts of different ways. And the most basic form is classical conditioning, and that's what we're going to cover, because no other type of learning theory would exist without the basic form, which is classical. It studies how organisms respond to stimuli in the environment. So in the experiment that we're going to talk about today with Ivan Pavlov, the actual stimuli is going to be a little bell and some dog food. And then it's going to be the reaction the animal is going to have to it that's going to cause where Ivan Pavlov is going to get this whole idea of classical conditioning. And then it's from classical conditioning that John B. Watson is going to come up with behaviorism, which is the school of thought, which is the perspective that we are what we learn. Everything that makes us who we are is something we've learned as we've gone from childhood to adulthood. And most of us are a product of what we've learned. So it's a very very good theory. And like I said, all other theories in the learning chapter would not exist if it not for classical conditioning. And as I said, being the most basic form of learning by which all organisms adapt, even your animals. Like, for example, I'm going to ask a really quick question because I actually have a cat that does this. Do any of you have animals like a dog or a cat at home? Anybody? Can someone answer in the chat? Okay. When you're going to feed your animal, do you ever like shake the bag or flick the can or make a sound? And then your animal comes running. Or they're like, get excited. Yeah, okay. They're classically conditioned that is food. You haven't even given them the food, but the sound that you make, they're associating that with getting fed. So if you kind of like think about it, and this is what I mean about the most basic form of learning. Can you think about your favorite food right now? Like for me, well, I ate already today, but for me, I like, well, we have carne asada fries here in Southern California. I don't know about you guys. And just the thought of it, when you think about it, do you notice when you're thinking about your favorite food, especially when you're hungry, what starts to happen in your mouth? Can anybody tell me? Yeah, it is really good too. It's got guacamole. Yeah, you salivate. Okay, so you're thinking about the food. You haven't even ate the food yet, and your mouth is already getting ready to digest it. Okay, you're classically conditioned for that. Like do you get that? Like you're already having a physical reaction, and you haven't even put the food in your mouth yet. Your animals are having a reaction to the sound that you're making with the product when you're about to feed them. Like I used to flick a cat when I would feed him canned food. I'd flick the can and the cat would come running because she associated that sound with getting fed. So she come running because she's like, I'm hungry, I want to eat. That is what they mean by a basic form of learning by association. Think about this. When you're in school, right? What makes you leave to go from one class to the next class? Can anybody tell me? How do you know when it's time to go to the next class? Exactly, right? The bell. You have at least through high school, all of your life, you've been as soon as the bell rings, what do you start to do? You start packing up, getting your stuff, getting up and walking out because the bell tells you when to go from one class to the next. So you've been classic and conditioned for the bell. Do any of you have multiple lunches at your school? Yeah, I'm one of those teachers. Sometimes I'll do that too. I say, I dismiss you, not the bell. But my kids have to really tick me off for that to happen. But I usually don't do that anymore because I teach juniors and seniors now. Most of them are well behaved. Do any of you have multiple lunches at your school? Like a first lunch and a second lunch? Okay. What happens when your lunch schedule gets thrown off? Do you notice that you get hungry around the same time you're used to eating? That's classical conditioning too. So classical conditioning is actually something that we don't even notice that we do every day. And so that's why when I say it's the most basic foundation of learning, it genuinely is. And to be perfectly honest with you guys, your teachers have been, since you were really, really young, have been conditioning you all your lives. The next type of learning, if you've done most of your vocab, because I make my students do vocab, right? They call this thing called operant conditioning. You guys know that vocab word, right? So watch this. How many of you remember being in elementary school, and if you had 5 gold stars at the end of the week, you got to put your hand in the treasure chest? If you had the good colored card, right? And you kept that good color card all week, you got to put your hand in the treasure chest. Yes, that, my dears, is psychology. That, my dears, is operant conditioning, which is born from classical conditioning. So like I said before, all this, as long as you understand the basic foundation of learning, the other ones will be a little bit easier to learn. Make sense? See, here's my Horror Nights cup. Oh my God, you guys. When I went to Halloween Horror Nights at Universal last night, everything was 70% off. I got this, I got a sweatshirt, and I got a t-shirt for $32. And I was like, dang. So I scored. And I'm half asleep and I'm tired as heck, but here I am teaching. All right. So the picture right here in the corner is kind of representative of Pavlov's experiment. So I'm going to walk over and we're going to talk about it a little bit. And if you have any questions or you're confused at any time, it's really important that you understand the process of UCS, UCR, CS, and CR. If you did your vocab or you have your teacher has you guys do vocab, you should have had like controlled stimulus, controlled response, uncontrolled stimulus, uncontrolled response. Okay, that's all part of classical conditioning. So for 2 decades, Ivan Pavlov, right, because he had no respect for psychology whatsoever. He thought psychology was a bunch of mumbo jumbo. You know, he didn't respect it as a science like most people did prior to the 1990s and 80s. He was studying the digestive system in animals. If any of you are PETA people, I really apologize. Yeah, if any of you are PETA people, I really apologize, but I'm going to explain to you the way his experiment worked, and you're really not going to like it because he had to cut a little hole in the dog so you can see how the digestive system worked, and he looked through a little plastic. Yeah, it was really not cool. But what he found was when he was studying, he wanted to study the digestive system of dogs. So he had a whole pen of animals, right? And he would take food to them. And before he took them the food, they would ring a bell. Okay. And let the animal know it's feeding time. And the dogs would get all crazy and happy because they're going to get fed. But what he started to notice, how many of you have a dog by any chance? Does anybody here have a dog? Okay. What do any of your dogs slobber a lot? Really slobber? Ew. Like me, I love animals, so I could care less, but some people have animals that slobber a lot. What he noticed is that all of the dogs, before the food was even fed to them, right? He's just trying to study how the digestive system, he's just trying to study how the digestive system works. But it starts to click in his head as he starts to notice that every time he rings the bell, the food's not even out. They haven't seen their bowls. They haven't seen the big bag of dog food coming. And they're already salivating, and the disgusting salivation is coming out of their mouth because they're already anticipating their eating. And so he found out that as soon as they rang the bell, the dog started to salivate. Okay, so prior to this all happening, it takes about 2 or 3 times to actually condition something. So you have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. This is before classical conditioning happens. And then after you do it a few times, you turn something into a conditioned stimulus into a conditioned response. So I want you to think like this. In this dog experiment, right, before the dogs had been doing this for the couple of weeks, the first 2 times that they did this, can anybody tell me what you think the unconditioned stimulus is? Not the bell. It's not the bell. Okay. What do you think the unconditioned stimulus is? Yeah, the food. Okay. And then the unconditioned response, because the dog sees food, what's going to happen? What happens in their mouths when they see food? Yes, they salivate. So that's the unconditioned response. So then they do this for a few weeks. And eventually the sound of the bell, the dogs start to what? Can anybody tell me? Just the sound of the bell, not the food. Yeah, salivate. So now the UCS and the CS are different. What is the CS now? What is the conditioned stimulus that sets the dogs to salivate? What makes this dog salivate now? It's not the food. It's the bell. Exactly, the bell. And then their conditioned responses to salivate. 9 times out of 10, and most of your teachers will give you a handout, because when I teach this, I always give my students a handout, and there's 8 scenarios. The CR and the UCR are the same. The CS and the UCS are different because the UCS is usually what the association that's made. The food is the association with the bell. So that way the food turns the bell into a stimulus. Does that make sense? Okay. But every once in a while, I'd say 98% of the time, you're going to have a different UCR. A different UCS and a CS, and the UCR and the CR are going to be the same thing. Okay. But every once in a while, there's one that throws off. You kind of have to read the scenario and be really paying attention to it. But let me give you a real life example of this besides Pavlov. Have any of you ever had food poisoning? Anybody? Food poisoning? Okay. So what was the food? Okay. How long? So when someone says Taco Bell, because I have someone to put Taco Bell, and it's that food, does the smell or just the name Taco Bell make you sick and you feel nauseated? Whenever, with me, okay, when, obviously, if you can't tell, Miss Valdez is Mexican. And when I was younger, my mom had my sisters made a communion, and we had a big party, and she paid this lady a lot of money to make 2 big sartenas, which is big pans, like soup pans of mole. Are any of you familiar with what mole is? Yep. No. If you don't know, it's like a Mexican soup, okay, of chicken. All right. And we had a party, and she made, well, it's not delicious to me. Let me tell you, it makes me sick as heck, and I'm going to explain why. Okay. So it's just like the food poisoning. So my mom pays this lady to make these 2 big pans, right? And then we only eat 1 pan, and she had this whole other pan of food, right? My mama, old school mama, she's like, waste not, want not. So she's like, we're going to eat this mole. And for a week, Miss Valdez right here had mole with eggs, mole in a sandwich. I have mole any way you could have mole, until I was so sick. The word mole just made me sick. Okay, so to this day, when people say, Miss Valdez, do you want some mole? And I automatically just wince, because I always remember that week where I just had mole. And it's the chocolate one too, the dark one, not the red one. If any of you are familiar, it's the dark one. And the kids are like, oh my God, Miss Valdez, you're missing out. I'm like, no, I don't want to touch that stuff. So it's the same concept of when you have food poisoning. Okay, so sometimes just the smell of that food, the name of that food that makes you sick, automatically just makes you automatically kind of wince or get nauseated, because you remember that feeling, that physical reaction you had. So like the dog, you've been classically conditioned. Whatever that food was for you is your bell. Does that make sense? The bell? So think about it like that. So like I said, the dog would salivate to a stimuli and associate the food with what Ivan Pavlov liked to call psychic secretions, just the thought of the food. My if you can't hear it, my family's getting ready to eat right now in the background, and they're having some kind of salad fries too. So like I was saying, it's that association thing that we do. Have any of you ever been in a car accident? Okay, so what happens now when you ride in a car and someone brakes really fast? Do you flinch? Do you find yourself flinching or kind of tensing? That's classical conditioning. I mean, sometimes we only have to experience something once. But it's whenever we associate something with an experience, it creates a classical conditioning experience within us. And that's much like Pavlov's dog. It's the most basic form of learning. And you can do this with human beings. You can do it, like I said, with your pets, with your animals. And every other learning theory is built on Pavlov's experiment. I was scared I had to eat a lime. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, me and mole don't go no more. And they're even menudo. When I was sick with my daughter, and I used to get morning sickness. Yeah, I had menudo has never tasted the same for me again after I had morning sickness when I was pregnant with my daughter. So like I said, all it takes is once. Sometimes all it takes is once. Sometimes it takes multiple times. By the way, do any of you have the Myers book in your classes? Do any of you use the Myers book? Okay, so this is a really great example in your Myers book. And I see it's in the updated one, so I'm going to assume you guys have it too. And I always like to talk to my students about it because I think it's hilarious as hell. But and it's a human example of classical conditioning. So like there's this guy and he's riding on a bus, right? And he looks out and they're driving on a street, and they explain the scenario, and it's actually a picture in your Myers book if you have it, if you look under the learning chapter. And I always tell the kids, because it's funny because most teenagers can relate to it. They're driving through downtown where they have all the food trucks, right? And all of a sudden he gets this really strong smell of onion. And all of a sudden his mind goes to his ex-girlfriend. And you think to yourself, how does onion remind you of your ex, right? And the scenario says that I guess when they were dating, they used to go out to eat. Yeah, no. She didn't smell like that. They used to go out to eat and eat hamburgers with onions together. And then right afterwards, they'd be kissing. So just the smell and the taste of onion. And that's the scenario your book has, which makes me laugh to this day. because I'm like, really? Teenagers don't do that. They care too much about how they smell and their breath. But that's the example your book has. But like I said, yeah, there's a graphic on it. Yeah, exactly. It's hilarious. But I think to myself, really? Yeah, it is funny. But classical conditioning is something that we experience every day, which is why I give my students, if any of you have seen my videos before, I'm a big believer that it's not just the book, but a lot of us learn better when we experience these things ourselves. That's why I ask all the questions. That's like, how many of you have an animal? How many of you had food poisoning? Because if you can relate it to your own personal experiences, it makes it easier to remember. Does anybody have any confusion or questions about the CR and the CS and the UCR and UCS? Because that could take some time, but once you get it, you will get it. I'm serious. Like once you understand it, it will not be hard at all. It actually is really easy. Okay. But as Pavlov's goal, once he went from studying the digestive system to studying theories about learning, he helped he might better understand the workings of the brain and how psychic secretions and all that works out, and how we as a species and other species can be classically conditioned too. I'm going to move to the next slide, but does anybody have any questions or any confusion about what I've been talking about? No, yep. We cool? Yes. All right, we'll move on. I'm still so tired, you guys. My eyes are all puffy. Went through like 8 mazes last night, and then I had surgery last week, so I was being wheeled around in a wheelchair, so I literally got scared by the scare actors in every maze. I mean, usually I can escape them, but last night I couldn't, so I'm a little bit tired. So Pavlov, who was all about hating psychology, is now remembered in psychology books. The irony is I even remember learning about him in my science classes. I remember the questions about the dog and the bell and the salivation. And if you really think about it, if you have really good science teachers, you might have heard about it at least once or twice, but it's more related to psychology. And Ivan Pavlov, he really wasn't trying to be remembered for psychology, even though he eventually ends up winning a Nobel Prize for his study on the digestive system. But and that's what he's taught in. I mean, he's taught in every psychology book talks about him, because he is the basic foundation for classical conditioning and behaviorism, which is a school of thought. And him and his colleagues would spend the next 30 years trying to study classical conditioning and how it works. Now, he did learn the following, which all of them should be key terms, which you all should be understand: acquisition being one, extinction being another, spontaneous recovery. I don't know why I have extinction on here twice, and discrimination. It should say generalization. I apologize, you guys, that's my fault. And generalization. So it should be acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. That these are all processes that can happen in classical conditioning. And I'm going to explain like basically what they are. The way I teach my students this, and it's part of like a way I torture them at the same time, which is kind of funny. I have a bell, and I turn all of my students into my little puppy dogs for about a week. And you ask, how does Miss Valdez do this? I do this very well. And it's funny too, because I've programmed it so well that I've had students who used to have me have what I call a spontaneous recovery. So I'm going to use the little experiment I do on my students to explain the following 5 things, okay? So the week I'm teaching about learning, and I start teaching about classical conditioning, I have my bell, which, you know, the teacher bell, a little ding, 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 when the teacher tries to get attention. And I tell my students, okay, so we're going to do a little participation game this week. And every time Miss Valdez rings the bell, doesn't matter when I ring the bell, I can ring it 5 times. I can ring it 6 times in a class period. I can ring it during lecture. I can ring it when we're watching a video. Every time I ring the bell, you have to move your seat. And they're like, what? I said, you have to move a seat. And I said, at the end of every day, I will give you an A for participation, as long as you're moving your seat. And I said, you will have 20 seconds to find a new seat. And they're like, really? And I'm like, yes. And then for every day, for 5 days, I give everybody an A. And I tell everybody, if you choose not to participate, guess what? You get an F for a day. Okay, so the kids will look at me, and then for like a week straight, every day for 5 consecutive days, I ring the bell, and I'll ring it like 8 times, 5 times, 6 times, 3 times, 2 times, right? And the kids look at me like, this is not PE, Miss Valdez. I said, I don't care, not PE. You in psychology class, we're gonna learn. And then after I've been doing it for about a week, there's my bell. The kids are moving their seats, and it's really funny to watch because, you know, I don't have any rules. I don't tell them you can just go back and forth from the next seat to the next one. They don't think. And I have kids flying across the room. It looks hilarious as hell, and I'm trying not to laugh, but it's funny. And I'm just known for torturing my students, but they're learning. So here we go. So I'm going to ask you guys this. In my little experiment with my bell and having the students move seats, can anybody tell me what the unconditioned stimulus is? I want you to think. Do you want me to repeat it again so I can explain the experiment? Anybody? Because I'm going to use it to explain acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, discrimination. So do you guys want me to repeat what I said, what I do? Anybody? Okay, so I have a bell, and I tell my students that every time I ring the bell in the class period that they're in, they have to move a seat. Okay, and as long as they do that the whole period, every time the bell rings, I will give them an A for the day. It goes into the grade book. Okay, so for 5 days straight, I ring the bell. I ring it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times in a period, sometimes only twice, sometimes 6, and they'll move because, you know, hello, they're going to get a grade for it. So can somebody tell me what the unconditioned stimulus is? Well, let me make life easier for you. What's the conditioned stimulus? Anybody? Wait. Okay. T-Zizzle is which is which? So what's the conditioned stimulus, T-Zizzle? Because I see your little sign on. Anybody? Yes, the bell is the conditioned stimulus. Okay. What's the UCR, the unconditioned response? Unconditioned stimulus. Sorry, pardon me. What's the unconditioned stimulus? Anybody? Well, besides T-Zizzle, anybody want to try? Let me put it this way. Why are they moving the seat? Yes, they want their A. They want the participation grade. Yes, the grade. Okay, so then what is the UCR and the CR? Remember, the UCR and the CR are the same thing. So what is it? Moving their seat. Yes. Okay. So you understand this. Acquisition in that experiment, the acquisition part is their acquisition. They're associating the bell with getting a what? The bell with getting a what? Can anybody tell me? What are they? A grade. There you go. So that's how acquisition works. Okay. Does that make sense now? Acquisition? Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay. So while I'm doing this, I'm kind of evil, and I will get my phone out and I'll go on YouTube and I'll play a bell ringing from the YouTube. Not my bell that I'm ringing, but a bell sound, just to see if they'll jump, right? To see if they can discriminate between my bell in the classroom and the bell sound from my phone. And the kids will literally still jump. Some of them will, okay? Why would they still jump? Watch this. They're still jumping because they're generalizing, which is the one that I was missing, okay? They're generalizing the sound. They hear a sound that sounds similar, so they're generalizing that. Does that make sense? Generalization now? Okay. The kids that don't jump and they're like, haha, I didn't fall for that trick, Miss Valdez. They can discriminate. They can discriminate between my bell sound and the sound coming from my phone. Does that make sense? Okay. So you got acquisition, which was acquiring the association between moving the seat and getting a grade. Yeah? Okay. And then we have when the bell sound goes off, when I'm playing the trick on them, and the students that don't move can discriminate between the sound of my bell on my desk and the bell sound coming from my phone. But then you have the students that do move, and they generalize the sound. Any sound that sounds familiar, they jump. Okay, so now so I only do this for like 5 days, right? And that next following Monday, I tell them, after Friday, you're not getting a grade anymore. Grades aren't happening. There's no A for moving your seat. So we'll be back in class next week on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And about Tuesday or Wednesday, I'll ring the bell just for the heck of it in the middle of class. And people will literally still jump up. I go, dude, what are you doing? Like, what do you mean, Ms. Valdez? I said, Friday was the last day you're getting a grade. Why are you doing that? Now, there's a lot of the kids in the room that don't move at all. Okay, they just sit there. That's because that classical conditioning response has become extinct. Does that make sense? Extinction, it's extinct. It doesn't work for them anymore because they know they're not going to get a grade and it's old. Yeah, okay. So as evil as I am, and I'm pretty evil, when I have my prep period, I tell the students, especially the week I'm doing the bell, I walk around campus and I'll tell certain teachers, I'm gonna pop open the door, and especially because I know a lot of the teachers have AP Psych, they'll have AP Lit and AP Calc. And I say, I'm gonna go in, I'm just gonna ring the bell, I'm gonna see if they're gonna jump up in your room, even though they're not getting a grade for moving in their room. And yes, I am that evil, and I have done this, and they can't. I go into the AP Lit room, and I'll say hi to the teacher, and they'll be teaching. All of a sudden, I'll ring the bell, and like 4 kids who have me will pop up in the AP Lit room. And last year, and this is why I'm bringing this up, when I did it, a student who had me from 2 years prior jumped up with them. He had what they call a spontaneous recovery. So we have acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, discrimination, and generalization. Those are the 5 things that Pavlov was able in those 30 years to expand on. And then from the very basic classical conditioning, we're going to have Skinner, who's going to come up with, does anybody know the name of the next type of conditioning there is? The next type of learning theory? The one that I told you your teachers used? Yes, Operant. So as I was saying, there's a little example of generalization when we respond to the stimuli that's similar, the 2 bells, the bell from my phone and the bell from the actual bell sitting on my desk. And then you have discrimination, and I have the picture of the Skittles. So you can, like, yes, Skittles all taste the same, some don't. To me, they taste the same. I like the flavor, but people discriminate between colors, and there'll be people that argue with me. No, they don't, Ms. Valdez. They have a flavor. Okay, discrimination. So does everybody understand the 5 process, the process of that we've gone from there? Okay. So how do I make Pavlov relevant to today? The thing that sucked about Pavlov in his 30 years of study, because he had very much bias when it came to psychology, he really was only studying the observable behavior of it. And he really didn't pay a lot of attention to the cognitive process that takes place when we have an association happening, because he was very much in like the thinking and the brain, and I don't believe these theories. So it limited his scope of what he was studying, and he didn't really expand on. And that's why other people were able to stand on his shoulders, if you get my meaning, because he limited himself. So his research only went so far. And it led to the underestimation of the importance of the cognitive process in it, where someone then goes in and talked about the importance of it, how cognitive, the way you think matters in these associations that we form. It matters with predictability. It matters with what we expect. And that the thought process actually counts. It's not just simple as a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response and a conditioned response. Yes, it's a very basic form of learning, and it's a very basic form of forming associations. However, cognitive process is important in it. It plays a role, especially because a lot of species have biological predispositions for things. And what I mean is by this, human beings are at the top of the food chain for my science people here, because we're one of the few species that you could take us out of our natural environment and we will adapt, okay? While other animals, have you guys ever heard of animals when they remove them from their natural habitat and they move them somewhere else, they actually die out and become extinct? Only certain species have the capacity for conditioning. And this is where biological predispositions matter. And environment is not the whole story. Every species disposes itself to learn a particular association that enhances their survival. I mean, it's like women. We don't go walking down a dark street at 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning because to us, or, our thought process, that's a dangerous thing to happen for a woman. Okay, it's not smart to be outside at midnight walking by yourself. Okay, animals have the same qualities. So Pavlov limited what he was studying because he refused to figure out how the cognitive process plays a role in UCR, CS, CR, and CS, if that makes sense. Yeah or no? Or is anybody kind of still like confused? Okay. So Pavlov's legacy, and do you guys see the little comic? And there's a dog, the dog's in therapy, and he's like, and then instead of feeding me, he just ring a little bell, like the dog's like traumatized. That's me and my little jokes. Sorry, I know they're corny, but that's just me. As I was referring to before, classical conditioning is the most basic form of learning. All of today's theories, observational learning, operant, conditioning, behaviorism, the school of thought of behaviorism, that we are what we learn. Think about everything that makes you who you are. They're all of your life experiences, the things you've learned through life. All of this stands on the shoulders of Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning experiment, a man who had no respect for psychology. And now he's remembered in the thing, and he's in every psychological book that we teach psychology. In fact, he's in my educational psychology book. When I became a teacher, I had to take educational psychology, and he's in there too. That's the irony of the situation. He's remembered more in psychology than in medical science. Funny, huh? It's the one way all organisms adapt to their environment by conditioning them. And the reason why he was okay with studying it is because he could visually and scientifically study it. It was a scientific model of studying learning objectively. There was no outside thought. There was no theory. There was no, like, you could do like the whole thing about psychology not being a real science. You could actually repeat his experiment. And that's what made it so scientific. So that's why Pavlov's like, I can do this. This isn't that bad. I don't mind being part of it now, because it was a scientific example of a psychological theory. And it could be tested in the lab. And like I said, we all know this for those of us that have animals, because we do it ourselves every day with our animals, making that little sound, the bell, shaking the bag, flicking the thing. And it can be applied. I mean, right here, it's applied to therapy. It can be applied to health, psychological disorders, emotions, motivations. I mean, let me put it this way. Okay. For my teenagers who really love music, is there a song that reminds you of somebody? That evokes an emotion? Like a memory? Yeah. I mean, and you've been classically conditioned because you associate that. Do you get it? The association, that early association process. You associate a smell, like a food that reminds you of somebody, or like the onion thing with the girlfriend. I mean, and something that motivates us. I mean, we can be classically conditioned to be motivated on positive negative reinforcements, which is an extension of operant conditioning, which wouldn't exist without classical conditioning. Psychological disorders and therapy, we are what we learn. Hello, a lot of people have suffer from psychological disorders because of the stuff they went through when they were younger. And then they go to therapy and they use classical conditioning to make people unlearn bad habits. So it's actually a part of everyday life. And Pavlov, we still talk about him today. And I have a feeling we'll continue to talk about him for the next 15, 20, 30 years.